courtroom air was thick with anticipation, every whisper hushed as the gavel slammed against the bench. Judge Beryl Howell leaned forward, her tone sharp, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. She spoke not just to assert order, but to humiliate, her voice laced with the confidence of someone who believed their authority would never be questioned. For a moment, the room belonged entirely to her glare, her command, her disdain. All eyes shifted to Jasmine Crockett, the young congresswoman seated across the room, her expression calm but unreadable. The judge's rebuke was harsh, designed to corner her, to silence her, to remind everyone who held the gavel. And in that charged silence, an unspoken expectation rippled through the crowd. Jasmine would take it. She would bow her head, swallow the insult, and let the judge have the final word. But Jasmine did not move. She did not flinch. The stillness around her seemed to intensify the tension, as if the walls themselves were waiting for her response. A spectator in the gallery stifled a nervous cough. Even the court clerks looked up from their papers, sensing something more than a routine exchange unfolding before them. Judge Howell pressed harder, her voice growing louder, her words dripping with condescension. She cited her authority invoked tradition and made it clear this was not Jasmine's arena. The judge's smirk was the smirk of establishment power, a kind that had silenced countless voices before. Yet in Jasmine's eyes, there was no fear, only calculation. Only the steady composure of someone who had faced down worse storms and walked away stronger. The room braced itself. People leaned forward, straining to catch even the slightest movement of her lips. Reporters tightened their grip on pens, already framing headlines in their minds. This was supposed to be another forgettable day, another demonstration of unchecked authority, and then Jasmine lifted her chin. Her voice, when it finally came, was not rushed, not desperate, but deliberate, measured, and unshakably confident. The very first words struck with precision. Echoing in the chamber with a weight far heavier than the judge's gavel, the silence broke into stunned gasps. Even Howell's confident posture faltered ever so slightly, but no one was prepared for what she said next. Judge Beryl Howell was no ordinary figure in the judiciary. Her reputation stretched far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Colleagues described her as formidable, uncompromising, and relentless. To some, she was the embodiment of judicial authority, stern, unwilling to let anyone slip past her sharp eye. To others, she was a bully in a robe, using intimidation and the weight of the bench not as tools of fairness, but as weapons of control. For years she had ruled her domain with an iron gavel, and few dared to challenge her. Stories circulated about her courtroom. Attorneys whispered about the way she could slice into arguments with surgical cruelty. Witnesses recalled her habit of leaning forward, eyes narrowing, as if she could break down testimony with her glare alone. Those who entered her court knew the game. You spoke carefully, you obeyed her tone, and above all, you did not embarrass her. That was the arena Jasmine Crockett had just stepped into. A congresswoman with roots in law, yes, but not a seasoned. A fixture of the establishment. To the judge, Jasmine was young, outspoken, and untested in the theater of judicial intimidation. This clash was more than a disagreement. It was a test of hierarchy, a reminder of who was supposed to sit in silence and who was allowed to command the room. And that is why the moment mattered so deeply. It wasn't simply about one remark or one heated exchange. It was a symbol of something far greater, the old guard, steeped in arrogance and tradition, against a new generation of leadership, bold, unapologetic, unwilling to bow. The audience sensed it. In the hushed gallery, the energy shifted. This wasn't routine. This was confrontation with stakes that reached far beyond the four walls of the courtroom. It was about whether voices of change would continue to be silenced by the machinery of authority, or whether dignity and brilliance could carve a space even in the most hostile environment. Jasmine knew what many in the room did not. She had faced dismissals before, mocked for her appearance, belittled for her identity, underestimated for her youth. Each time, she had refused to shrink. Each time, she had proven she belonged. And in this moment, she recognized that every word she chose, every pause she allowed, every point she struck would not only define her own reputation, it would echo far beyond this day. Judge Howell, in her calculated coldness, believed she was simply asserting dominance, but unknowingly, she was setting the stage for a battle that would capture headlines, spark debate, and ignite something larger. The walls of the courtroom seemed to tighten around the confrontation. Spectators clutched at the edges of their seats. Staff avoided eye contact, careful not to appear aligned with either side. Porters, sensing history unfolding, scribbled frantically, determined not to miss a single line, because everyone knew this wasn't ending with silence. Something was building in energy, a shift, a coming storm. Jasmine's calm composure was not weakness, it was preparation. The longer she waited, the more powerful her next move would become. The judge might have had the gavel, but Jasmine had something more potent, a lifetime of resilience, sharpened into brilliance, ready to explode at exactly the right time. And as the room hung in suspense, one thought consumed the air. What happens next will shake the foundations of this courtroom, Judge. Beryl Howell had long been regarded as one of the sharpest minds in her field, but sharpness alone did not define her. It was the edge of her personality, the biting tone, the dismissive glare, the air of superiority that made her infamous in legal circles. For years, she had thrived in a world where intimidation was a tool and fear was a language she spoke fluently. Colleagues described her as relentless. Critics, less generous, called her arrogant. And while the descriptions varied, one truth was constant. Howell believed she owned every room she entered. Her bench was her stage, and she performed with all the confidence of someone who knew few would dare to push back. Attorneys who stepped before her learned quickly that she had little patience for hesitation or contradiction. If you stumbled, she pounced. If you dared to challenge her, she doubled down. Her rulings were often handed down with the kind of finality that suggested not just legal authority, but personal victory. To lose in her court wasn't simply procedural, it felt like being humiliated. Past controversies had etched her reputation. Deeper, she had on more than one occasion raised eyebrows by scolding lawyers in open court with language so biting it bordered on personal attack. Critics noted her tendency to blur the line between professional critique and public belittlement. There were whispers that she relished those moments, that the courtroom gasps were less a side effect than a reward. For Howell, power wasn't just about justice, it was about dominance. Even her body language told the story. She sat with her shoulders squared, chin raised, eyes narrowing into a piercing glare that made defendants squirm and attorneys stumble. Over their words, a subtle smirk would play at her lips when she sensed an opponent faltering. To her, silence in the courtroom was not just order, it was submission. And she had mastered the art of extracting it. Some hailed her sternness as strength, claiming she upheld discipline where others grew lenient. But beneath that veneer of professionalism lay a pattern of overreach. Moments where her authority seemed less about justice and more about reminding everyone who held the gavel. Reporters chronicled her sharpest rebukes, often quoting her with a mix of awe and unease. In one high-profile case, her fiery comments toward a defense attorney overshadowed the trial itself, dominating headlines. What should have been a story about evidence and testimony turned into a spectacle about her temper. Yet Howell never flinched from the criticism. If anything, she appeared to feed off it. To her supporters, she was untouchable, a guardian of the court. To her detractors, she was the very embodiment of judicial arrogance, a figure who wielded authority not as a shield of fairness, but as a weapon of control. And in an era where accountability was increasingly demanded of leaders, Howell seemed curiously immune. That immunity fueled resentment. Lawyers left her courtroom shaking their heads. Defendants walked away feeling crushed, not only by rulings, but by the way they had been treated, as though their voices had no place in her domain. Even some colleagues privately admitted that Howell's approach was unnecessarily combative, but few ever confronted her directly. After all, she was the judge. She had the robe, the gavel. In the final say, it was in that very context that she approached Jasmine Crockett. To Howell, Jasmine was just another challenger, another ambitious figure who could be cut down to size with a few sharp words and a commanding glare. She expected compliance. She expected silence. She expected the same submission she had extracted from countless others who had stood where Jasmine now stood, as Howell delivered her rebuke. The same old choreography played out. The narrowed eyes, the clipped tone, the calculated pause designed to leave Jasmine squirming in the silence. To the judge, this was routine. She was simply reasserting her dominance, reminding everyone that no matter how loud or confident an outsider seemed, they would bow once they entered her arena. But there was one problem. Jasmine was not like the others who had faced her wrath. She was not cowed by arrogance, nor rattled by authority used as a weapon. She had faced the smirks, the dismissals, the attempts to silence voices like hers. For years, and each time, she had risen stronger. Judge Howell, in her self-assuredness, had overlooked that fact. She assumed this would be yet another easy performance, another show of power to keep her legend alive. But arrogance unchecked often breeds blindness. And Howell was blind to the reality building before her that this clash would not end like the others, that she was about to encounter a force she had not anticipated, because this time, she was up against someone very different. Before she was a congresswoman facing down a federal judge, Jasmine Crockett was a girl growing up in circumstances that rarely produce leaders. Her story began far from the polished halls of Washington. She was raised in a world that didn't hand out opportunities easily, where ambition was often dismissed as arrogance, and where voices like hers, young, black female, were too often expected to stay quiet. But Jasmine never accepted silence as her destiny. Even as a child, she carried herself with a stubborn resolve, refusal to bow to the idea that her path had already been written for her. Education was her first battleground. While others doubted her, she buried herself in books, chasing knowledge with a hunger that couldn't be dismissed. Teachers who underestimated her would later remember the sharpness of her questions, the fire in her eyes when she spoke about fairness and accountability. She didn't just want to do well, she wanted to understand how systems worked, and more importantly, how they could be changed for those who were always overlooked. That passion led her into law. For Jasmine, becoming a lawyer wasn't about prestige or paycheck. It was about service. She understood that courtrooms were places where lives could be remade or ruined by a single ruling. She had seen what happened when people couldn't afford adequate representation, when voices were drowned out by technicalities and procedures they couldn't comprehend. And so she chose the harder road, working cases that many others wouldn't touch, defending those society had written off, standing beside clients whose only hope was the tenacity of their attorney. The work was grueling. Long nights, endless paperwork, the emotional toll of seeing injustice up close. There were moments of doubt nights when she stared at her files and wondered if the fight was too steep, if the system was too broken to bend. But time and again, Jasmine refused to give in. Every small victory, every life spared from the crushing weight of a biased system reaffirmed her purpose. She wasn't just practicing law, she was living it as a calling. Her sacrifices were countless. Friends saw her less, family missed her presence, her personal life often took a back seat. But Jasmine carried those sacrifices with pride because she knew what was at stake. She wasn't just fighting for clients, she was fighting for communities. For people who had been told that justice wasn't built for them, and each courtroom appearance sharpened her skills, teaching her to think quickly under pressure, to dismantle arguments piece by piece, to command attention with clarity and confidence. That journey forged something rare. Not just a lawyer, but a strategist, a fighter, a voice that could not be ignored. Her reputation grew not as someone who sought headlines, but as someone who would not back down from the toughest fights. Judges noticed her precision, opponents respected her preparation, and communities rallied around her courage. It was that relentless drive that eventually carried her into politics. She hadn't dreamed of power for its own sake. Instead, she recognized that the injustices she fought in individual cases were symptoms of larger systemic failures. The same arrogance she faced in courtrooms was written into laws, policies, and traditions that tilted the scales against ordinary people. If she wanted to change the bigger picture, she had to step into the political arena. Her campaign was anything but easy. She faced doubt, skepticism, and the familiar chorus of voices questioning whether someone like her could win. But Jasmine leaned on the same lessons that had carried her through law: preparation, resilience, and authenticity. She spoke not in rehearsed slogans, but from lived experience. Voters didn't just see a politician, they saw someone who had stood beside them in the trenches of real struggles. They saw a woman who had earned her place not through privilege, but through relentless persistence. When she won, it wasn't just her victory, it was a statement. A statement that voices once dismissed could not only rise, but lead. A statement that the courtroom fighter was now a policymaker, ready to challenge injustice on an even larger scale. And so when Jasmine found herself under Judge Howell's sharp glare, it wasn't an unfamiliar feeling. She had been belittled before, underestimated before, dismissed before. Every smirk Howell cast, every condescending remark, was an echo of the battles Jasmine had fought her entire life. But those past battles had forged her resilience, had carved into her the discipline to remain calm under pressure, and had given her the wisdom to know that silence used strategically could be as powerful as words. To the untrained eye, she might have seemed cornered that day in court. But to Jasmine, this was just another test she had been preparing for since the first time someone told her she didn't belong. And though the judge thought she held all the power, Jasmine knew better. Her past battles had uniquely prepared her for this exact moment. The courtroom air thickened with tension. Every shuffle of papers, every cough from the gallery, every creak of a wooden bench seemed amplified as Judge Beryl Howell adjusted her glasses and leaned forward, her voice slicing through the chamber like a cold blade. "Miss Crockett," she said sharply, "this is not a campaign rally. This is a courtroom. And you will answer my questions directly, without embellishment." The gavel struck once more, not to maintain order, but as a weapon, a reminder of who supposedly controlled the room. Gasps rippled across the gallery. The message was clear. Howell wanted dominance, not dialogue. Jasmine Crockett, however, did not flinch. Her eyes remained steady, her posture upright. She listened. She waited. She let the silence speak louder than the judge's threats, but Howell was not finished. "This behavior," the judge snapped, "borders on contempt. If you cannot restrain yourself, I will ensure you learn the consequences." The words hung like smoke, heavy and suffocating. In that instant, it seemed the entire courtroom leaned against Jasmine, expecting her to buckle. A younger lawyer or a nervous politician might have folded under the weight of intimidation. The audience could almost feel the invisible hand of authority pressing down, demanding surrender. Instead, Jasmine simply tilted her head, studying Howell as though she were a puzzle unraveling itself. The interruptions became relentless. Each time Jasmine tried to speak, Howell cut in, dismissing, correcting, undermining. The pattern was obvious, a deliberate attempt to rattle her, to make her stumble. It was the same strategy Howell had used countless times before to grind witnesses and challengers into submission. Yet the more Howell pressed, the calmer Jasmine became. Her measured breathing contrasted the judge's sharp tone. Her stillness against Howell's flaring gestures painted a striking picture, a storm raging on one side of the bench, unshakable steadiness on the other. The gallery noticed. Whispers began to ripple among the spectators. Buzzed as observers live-tweeted each exchange. Even seasoned reporters scribbled faster, sensing they were witnessing more than just a courtroom squabble. Howell's voice rose. "You will respect the authority of this bench, Miss Crockett." Jasmine folded her hands on the table, her gaze unwavering. Not submissive, not combative, but resolute. She had weathered storms before. She had been underestimated before. And she knew the moment was approaching when restraint would no longer be enough. The energy in the room shifted. It wasn't just a clash of words now. It was a test of wills, a duel of patience. Howell pushed harder, desperate to provoke. Jasmine absorbed it all, like stone against crashing waves. The suspense grew unbearable. Spectators leaned forward. Journalists adjusted their cameras. Even Howell's clerk seemed to sense that something unexpected was brewing. And then, as the judge launched yet another interruption, Jasmine moved. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward, placing her palms flat on the polished wood before her. Her eyes locked on the bench with unshakable intensity. The chatter in the gallery died instantly. Could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Everyone knew something was about to happen, and then Jasmine opened her mouth, and everything changed. The judge's gavel struck against the bench like a hammer on iron, echoing through the courtroom. For the past hour, Judge Beryl Howell had deployed every tactic in her arsenal of interruptions. Dismissive waves of her hand, clipped remarks delivered with a knowing smirk. The power imbalance was clear. Howell was used to ruling her courtroom. With iron authority, her voice often the final word. But Jasmine Crockett was unlike the opponents Howell had faced before. For much of the exchange, Jasmine sat still, pen between her fingers, her body angled just slightly forward. To a casual observer, she might have looked passive, absorbing the reprimands, the warnings, the legal gymnastics Howell attempted. But those who knew her understood. Jasmine Crockett did not sit silently out of weakness. She listened. She waited. She chose her moment with surgical precision, and when it came, it landed with the force of a tidal wave. The pivot, Judge Howell leaned back, folding her arms with a look that bordered on smugness. "Congresswoman, your objections have no standing in this court. Your interpretation of precedent is frankly misplaced." That single word, misplaced, hung in the air, sharp and condescending. Few attendees shifted in their seats. Cameras clicked. This was the blow meant to end the exchange. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she set her pen down carefully, as if preparing to clear the battlefield. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet Howell's, steady, unblinking. When she spoke, her voice was low, measured, deliberate. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, her words slicing through the tension. "What you've just stated overlooks not only established precedent, but the very constitutional foundation of this hearing." Room stilled. The strike Jasmine didn't rush. That was the brilliance of it. Each word landed like a hammer, carefully swung to crack stone without missing the mark. "Let us recall United States v. Nixon, 418 U.S. 683, 1974. The court ruled unanimously that not even the president is above the law, establishing that judicial review extends into the highest echelons of power when constitutional integrity is at stake. If this court acknowledges that principle as it must, then the standard you're attempting to apply here collapses under its own weight." Gasps. Heads turned. Phones tilted upward as attendees began capturing every second. Howell's face stiffened. Though she tried to mask it with a practiced neutrality, Jasmine pressed forward and further. She continued, her finger tapping the table lightly in rhythm with her words. "And the ruling in Marbury v. Madison 1-803 makes explicit that it is the duty of the courts to say what the law is, not to warp it to protect convenience or power structures. To suggest otherwise, as your argument implicitly does, would be to undermine centuries of constitutional jurisprudence." The silence was now deafening. The cinematic pause. Jasmine stopped. She didn't speak. She let the silence swell, a dramatic pause that allowed the weight of her words to settle into every corner of the courtroom. The judge's face, once immovable, flickered ever so slightly, an almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes. It was the kind of pause seasoned attorneys deploy when they know they've cornered their adversary. The audience knew it too. Whispers broke out in the back rows. Someone audibly exhaled, as though they had been holding their breath. Breaking the facade, Judge Howell leaned forward, attempting to reassert control. Her voice, though steady, carried a faint edge. "Congresswoman, I would remind you that this is my courtroom. Your interpretations may play well for the cameras, but they hold little water here." But Jasmine smiled, a small, confident smile that sent ripples through the crowd. "With respect, Judge Howell," she said, her tone firm but never raised. "The cameras didn't write these precedents. The Constitution did. And while this may be your courtroom, The law belongs to the people. My duty is not to flatter power, but to uphold the very system you swore an oath to protect." Another audible reaction surged through the audience.
Yikes.
Words were calm, measured, but their impact was seismic. The viral moment in that instant. Every smartphone in the room became an instrument of history. Clips would later be replayed across social media with captions like Jasmine Crockett schooling Judge Howell in real time, and when the student teaches the teacher. Commentators would dissect the exchange, frame by frame. The deliberate cadence of Jasmine's rebuttal, the way she leaned forward just slightly at the crescendo of her argument, the faint, unmistakable crack in Howell's composure as her authority was chipped away by pure, undeniable logic. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't just a participant in the courtroom, she was the conductor of its silence, the architect of its turning tide. Villain's confidence cracks for the first time. Howell shifted in her chair. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle movement, the kind of adjustment that betrayed unease. She attempted to regain footing by flipping through her notes. But the gesture looked more like retreat than command. The imbalance of power had inverted, every time. Howell opened her mouth to retort. Jasmine had another citation, another precedent, another razor-sharp counterargument. She anticipated Howell's points before they even fully emerged, dismantling them brick by brick. It wasn't aggression, it was precision. Jasmine wasn't trying to embarrass Howell. She was simply revealing the emptiness of her bluster. The closing blow finally, Jasmine leaned in, her voice steady and unwavering. "Your Honor, your history will not remember who interrupted the most, nor who held the gavel. It will remember who upheld the law with integrity. If that burden falls to me today, so be it. But I cannot allow constitutional principle to be trampled under the guise of authority." The line hit like a thunderclap. Cameras clicked. Furiously, someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Judge Howell froze. Her lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes betraying the weight of Jasmine's words. In that instant, she wasn't the all-powerful judge presiding over the courtroom. She was simply another official confronted by the undeniable force of truth. The cliffhanger. Jasmine sat back slowly, reclaiming her pen with the same calmness with which she had set it down earlier. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply resumed her composure, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone in the room knew something seismic had shifted, and as the gavel trembled slightly in Howell's hand, one truth became undeniable. By the time Jasmine Crockett finished, the judge's expression told the entire story. The room had barely settled when the ripples began. What started as a courtroom clash between Judge Beryl Howell and Representative Jasmine Crockett quickly transformed into a cultural earthquake, one that would spill far beyond the four walls where it began. It took less than an hour for the first clip to hit social media. A shaky cell phone recording caught Jasmine's voice steady and unflinching as she dismantled Howell's reasoning, followed by that haunting silence in the room, the silence of a judge who suddenly had no come back. By the time the clip had been uploaded, subtitled, and shared, it had already been retweeted hundreds of times. Within minutes, it was everywhere. The hashtag #StormA single hashtag rose above the noise. Hashtag Crockett Checkmate. At first it trended locally, then it spread like wildfire. Comment threads exploded with admiration. Some users broke down Jasmine's arguments in long Twitter threads, explaining the brilliance of her case law references. Others simply shared memes. Howell's stern face on one side, Jasmine's poised smirk on the other, with captions like, "When you finally meet your match." Facebook groups lit up. Instagram reels looped the moment Jasmine leaned forward, eyes locked on Howell, just before unleashing her decisive blow. TikTok creators remixed the footage with dramatic music, editing and sound effects of chess pieces. Slamming down, or the words "game over" flashing across the screen. What made it unstoppable wasn't just the drama, it was the symbolism. For many, Jasmine wasn't just defending herself. She was defending anyone who had ever been talked over, dismissed, or belittled by someone who thought their authority made them untouchable. Voices across the spectrum, commentators from both sides of the political aisle weighed in. a conservative host, known for rarely giving credit to his opponents. Admitted on air, "I don't care what side of the aisle you're on." Crockett was prepared, precise, and she owned that room. Progressive commentators were even more effusive. One called her the legal mind of her generation. Another compared the moment to a young attorney dismantling a professor in a moot court, except this was real, and the stakes were higher. Even celebrities couldn't resist. A-list actors posted clips with captions like "Queen Energy." A Grammy-winning rapper tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just reminded us why you never underestimate a smart woman with receipts." The viral wave crossed demographics, uniting unlikely corners of the internet in collective awe. Rivals forced to acknowledge Jasmine's political rivals were boxed in, not normally eager to dismiss or downplay her. Some were forced into grudging admiration. A senior lawmaker, often hostile toward her, was asked about the exchange in a TV interview. His pause spoke volumes. Finally, he muttered, "Well, I'll say this. She handled herself better than most would have." That clip went viral too, not because of what he said, because of the sheer difficulty he had admitting it. Beyond the courtroom, the shockwaves didn't stop at commentary. Law schools began circulating the clip in classrooms, professors analyzing Jasmine's rhetoric and strategy as a masterclass in controlled persuasion. Legal forums buzzed with debate over the precedents she cited, not just for their accuracy, but for how skillfully she wove them into the narrative. For young women in particular, the moment became something else entirely, a rallying cry. High school debate clubs replayed the exchange for inspiration. College students printed screenshots with the caption, "Stay calm, stay smart, stay Crockett." Even late-night comedy shows jumped in. Monologues featured skits of actors playing the judge, fumbling as Jasmine coolly dismantled them. The laughter was cathartic, but beneath the humor was an unmistakable truth: Judge Howell's untouchable. Aura had cracked. The shift in discourse before this clash. Judge Beryl Howell had been largely viewed as a formidable figure, stern and untouchable. But after Jasmine's counterattack, that perception shifted. Conversations about unchecked authority, courtroom demeanor, and respect for elected representatives surged into the mainstream. Articles appeared with titles like "The Day Authority Met," "Accountability," and "When Dismissiveness Backfired." Suddenly, the debate wasn't just about Crockett versus Howell. It was about power itself and how it should be wielded. For Jasmine, this was more than validation. It was fuel. She knew moments like this didn't come often, and she refused to let it be reduced to a single viral clip. Cliffhanger. The bigger play because Jasmine Crockett didn't stop at the courtroom. As the hashtags climbed, as the news anchors replayed the footage, she was already plotting her next move. To her, this wasn't just about silencing one judge's arrogance. It was about channeling the energy into something lasting, something bigger and soon. The world would see exactly how she planned to do it. When the noise of the viral storm began to settle, Jasmine Crockett stood at a crossroads not of politics or law, but of meaning. For days, the internet replayed her clash, with Judge Howell in slow motion, dissecting every word, every raised eyebrow, every measured pause. Yet Jasmine knew that if the moment were remembered only as a personal victory, it would lose its deepest value. So she reframed it. In her next public statement, Jasmine didn't speak about winning against a judge. She spoke about why the moment mattered. "This was never about me versus her," she began, her voice calm but charged with purpose. "It was about every person who's ever been told to sit down when they had something true to say. It was about every worker silenced in a meeting, every citizen ignored by their government, every student dismissed by someone who thought their age or accent meant they had nothing to contribute. Dignity matters. Justice matters. Courage matters." The courtroom exchange, Jasmine explained, was not just an isolated confrontation. It was a mirror held up to society. Too often, power disguises itself as authority, and intimidation masquerades as wisdom. Judge Howell's interruptions, dismissals, and threats were not unique. They echoed what millions experience daily from bosses, officials, even strangers who mistake arrogance for strength. Jasmine's stand was not an act of defiance for herself alone. It was an act of representation. The lesson she drew was timeless. Truth carries a weight that intimidation cannot crush. In speeches that followed, Jasmine broadened the moral. When you stand for what's right, even in a room designed to silence you, the truth has a way of expanding beyond those four walls. It cannot be contained. That is why people saw themselves in that moment. That is why it resonated. The response confirmed her words. Messages poured in from teachers, nurses, single parents, and young lawyers. They didn't just congratulate her. They shared their own stories of being dismissed, spoken over, or underestimated, and how her composure gave them new courage. A teacher wrote, "Next time a colleague talks over me, I'm channeling my inner Jasmine." A law student admitted, "I almost dropped out after being told I wasn't cut out for this field. Watching you reminded me why I started." Her clash with Howell had become more than a trending moment. It had become a parable, and Jasmine herself leaned into the role of storyteller. On podcasts, at rallies, in interviews, she repeated the same refrain, "This is bigger than me." Each time she said it, she dissolved the temptation to see the viral clip as mere entertainment. She transformed it into a moral compass, guiding others toward courage. In the end, the true power of the showdown wasn't that Jasmine Crockett embarrassed a federal judge. It was that she elevated the collective spirit of those watching. She reminded people that authority can be questioned, arrogance can be answered. And truth, when spoken with clarity and conviction, will always leave a mark deeper than fear, as one commentator summed it up. The real mic drop wasn't when Jasmine finished her argument. It was when she reminded us that we each hold a mic of our own. It became the enduring moral. For Jasmine, the confrontation was never the climax. It was a bridge. A bridge between a viral moment and a lasting lesson. Between individual pride and shared empowerment. Between the courtroom clash and a cultural awakening, the story's end, then, is not about who won or lost in that heated room. It's about what lives on in the minds of those who witnessed it. Jasmine Crockett left people not only cheering, but reflecting. And in that reflection, they found themselves. Because ultimately, the clash was never about Jasmine versus Howell. It was about all of us versus silence. And silence lost what began. As an attempt to humiliate her ended as proof that brilliance will always outshine arrogance. Every interruption, every dismissive glance, every attempted intimidation, Jasmine turned them into stepping stones toward an even greater triumph. This wasn't just about a courtroom clash. It was about something much bigger. It was about truth standing firm against power. It was about justice refusing to be silenced. And it was about the courage to remain calm when others tried to provoke, belittle, or intimidate. Jasmine's victory wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. She reminded all of us that in a world full of noise, the sharp clarity of truth can cut through like lightning. She showed that when you know your facts, when you stand on principle, and when you refuse to back down, no amount of bluster can shake you. So the moral is simple. Brilliance is stronger than arrogance. Justice is greater than intimidation. And courage is contagious. Now it's your turn. If Jasmine's stand inspired you, if her composure, her strength, and her brilliance gave you hope, then let's keep that energy alive. Subscribe for more stories where truth triumphs. Share this video so others can see what courage looks like in real time. And remember, every time you stand tall in the face of pressure, you're writing your own story of victory. Because like Jasmine proved, dignity always wins in the end.